Hello. Today we're going to be comparing the Blackmagic Ursa Mini 4.6K and my Canon C100 Mark II. We're going to be mainly focusing on just the image quality, but we'll talk a little bit about the practicality and usability of both cameras. All of the footage that you're going to see was shot in log, and it has been color graded in Resolve using a mixture of LUTs and color curves. The Blackmagic was recording at UHD and the C100 Mark II was recording at 1080p to an external recorder. Both cameras were recording to ProRes LT. Both cameras are using a Sigma Art 18-35 f1.8. This is Angus.
Hi.
So first of all, we started with a dynamic range test, and from looking at the image on the back of the camera monitors, it appeared that the C100 Mark II was winning. This seemed a little bit strange, so we had to look at the settings on the Ursa Mini, and we discovered that, well, this was a camera that was rented from the uni equipment hire, and we discovered that the group before us who were using the camera, they had no idea what they were doing, because it was set to shoot in the video mode, not the film mode. So in other words, it was getting less dynamic range than the C100 Mark II. We went back, redid the tests after having changed the Ursa Mini to film mode, and that went about as well as you'd expect for the C100 Mark II. That camera very clearly does not have the same amount of dynamic range as the Ursa Mini. If we look at the sky, we can see it's mostly blown out. In fact, there's really little splodge here of detail. Other than that, it is not really recoverable. Nothing can be brought back here in the highlights. Looking on the floor, again there are some clipped areas, maybe a few clipped areas on the sofa too. Switching over to the Ursa Mini shot and looking at the sky, there's a little bit of cloud that looks like it's clipped, but other than that you can see a lot of detail in the sky, and the floor hasn't clipped, nor have the sofas. I'd say that there's also a little bit more shadow detail in the Ursa Mini footage too. Now all this footage has been graded just with an initial color correction. I haven't tried to match the cameras too closely, I've just got the exposure levels about right, maybe a little bit of color tweaking, but in general this is pretty close to what came out of the camera converted from log to a more Rec 709 type video signal. Next we did a dynamic range test in the kitchen, and you can see that once again the Ursa Mini has a lot more shadow detail. We exposed for the window outside, but interestingly there appears to be an awful lot of noise in the Ursa Mini shot that isn't really there in the Canon shot. The shadows also look a little bit bluey purple to my eye too, so I'm not sure what to make of this. It's possible that effectively the Ursa Mini doesn't quite have as much dynamic range as it does when it's outside because of the shadow detail. If the shadow detail is making some of the color range unusable, then that actually brings the Ursa Mini closer in dynamic range to the C100 Mark II. But having said that, looking at the countertop, quite clearly you can see that there is more detail there than there is in the C100 Mark II. Even me, a Canon cinema fan, can acknowledge this. Next we did a low light test, which as you'd imagine was very close. Actually, no, it wasn't close at all. To no surprise, the C100 Mark II is clearly the superior low light camera. The shot from the Ursa Mini looks quite grainy, and there seems to be a sort of a bluey magenta cast. Looking at the C100 Mark II image, it's pretty clean, it's perfectly usable actually. Then we underexposed the cameras and I pushed the levels a little bit in post to simulate shooting in a really low light condition. And the Ursa Mini did absolutely terribly here, much to my delight. You can see that there's an awful lot of noise, there's a weird blue-purple smudginess. This is really not usable whatsoever. On the other hand, the C100 Mark II did pretty well. It's not as clean as the shot that I did before, but it's definitely still usable. It's definitely not all smudgy and horrible, and there doesn't seem to be much of a cast in the shadows. When I bump up the ISO on the C100 in the next shot, there is a bit more noise in the image, but it's still a lot cleaner than the image coming out of the Ursa.
It was kind of tough.
It was tough.
Yeah. It's pretty heavy compared to this little setup.
Yeah, for me it wasn't too bad actually.
I think the tripod alone weighs about the same as that whole setup. So putting the camera on top of that, it's pretty crazy.
See, for me it was just a nice leisurely stroll down to this nice park. Next we went outside to do some daylight exterior shots. Bear in mind it was a very sunny day, so this was quite difficult shooting conditions, and it definitely favoured the Ursa with the greater dynamic range. Here we can really start to see the colour differences. In the Ursa footage, there's a bit more of an orange tint in the image. If you look at the orangey green area of the trees, there's a lot more warm colours there than there are in the C100 footage. On the other hand, the sky looks a lot more deep blue coloured in the C100 footage. And if we zoom in a bit, you can really see that the Ursa Mini's 4K has quite a lot more detail than the C100's 1080p. Although the C100 does do really well for a full HD camera. I imagine that's because of the 4K downsampling. Next, we pointed the cameras directly into the sun with a few branches in between. I'm not really sure what we learned from this test, but you can see the difference in colours between the image. As we go through a few more test shots, you can see that the results are pretty similar. There's a colour difference between the Ursa and the C100. The C100 has not as much detail, and there's a bit less information in the undertones of the image. I find this next shot quite interesting because whilst I do think that the C100 has a nicer way of handling the colour red, you can see that there's a very big difference between them, which I think goes beyond colour science. Because of the Ursa's greater dynamic range, the actual red here, because it's in the shadow, it's a lot brighter and it's at a completely different luminance level to the red in the C100. Then we did a test to really show off the dynamic range on the Ursa Mini. We exposed the Ursa Mini to the optimum exposure so that the shadows weren't clipped and there was still plenty of detail in the shadow, and then we matched the exact settings on the C100 Mark II. Looking at the Ursa footage, all looks good. There's plenty of detail in the highlights, plenty of detail in the shadows, and then we look at the C100 Mark II footage and you can see that half of the sky is completely blown out. There's very little cloud detail left at all, only the grey bits can really be distinguished. But what I find interesting is when you look really closely at the two shots, there's actually a very similar amount of detail in the shadows and the undertones. So if you were to lower the exposure by a stop or two on the C100, you would preserve all of the highlighter detail, and really the difference in shadow detail isn't too bad. So you can still get by with 12 stops of dynamic range as long as you have a logged profile.
Is that like a, what have you got like in percentage? Or does this one not give you percentage?
Oh, it says camera gives me 84%.
You've got 84%. I've only got bars. I've got out of focus, there we go, I've got 4 bars.
4 out of...
4.
Okay, well I've got 5 out of 5.
So
technically I have more power.
In this scientific test we have proved absolutely nothing.
In this shot of the John Hazard gallery, you can see a very big difference in colours. But also looking at the shadows in the black building on the right, there's a very big difference. In fact, it looks like it was shot at a different time of day practically. I think this shot helps to show off what I mean about the difference in the way the two cameras handle the colour red. To my eye, the C100, it looks a little bit nicer and it's definitely more realistic. Again, Van going past shows the difference in how the two cameras handle the colour red.
What did you just say?
Well,
something about the focus peaking?
Like it shows me like very defined lines. Like the lines on your camera I can focus on, but like focusing on your eyes, it's not really giving me much help.
In other words, my camera's better.
Looking at the skin tones in this outside shot, it's actually a little difficult to call a winner. And because Angus took a little while to focus for C100, it meant that the lighting conditions had changed, so that makes it a bit harder to compare as well.
He's filming me out of focus.
I'm ready.
He's deliberately sabotaging this test.
I'm trying to call a winner on this shot, but it is quite difficult to do. Next, moving on to the indoor skin tones, I think that C100 does win here. Again, it's pretty close, but I think the Ursa's skin tones look a little bit more pink than the C100, and I think that the little bit extra pinkness makes the C100 skin tones better than the Ursa's. But again, it's still pretty close. And also, we have a shot of Angus, in case you wanted to see Angus operating the Ursa Mini.
How would you say that test went?
Well, I know which camera I would choose for run and gun filmmaking, and it certainly wouldn't be this one.
That one. It kept coming down to like the dynamic range though.
Yeah, every test we did, it was always sort of determined by dynamic range.
I know, it's 15 stops compared to the 12 on the C100.
It's a huge difference, like way more than you'd expect.
I'm gonna have to see like how closely I can match them in post with some curves or something, but it just makes me want a C200 or a red. That doesn't make me want a Blackmagic. It's big and heavy. And the viewfinder doesn't work.
This viewfinder doesn't work.
That viewfinder doesn't. I mean, it's a Blackmagic, something's gonna break. All the Blackmagic fan people are gonna hate me now.
They might do.
I think they already hate me. They already hate me. No harm done. We like to stay nice and neutral and unbiased on this channel.
I had high hopes for the Blackmagic. I'm not so sure about it anymore. Now that I've spent about a day just out and about filming with it, it's kind of annoyed me in quite a few ways.
So 3, and out of focus 3. What does the camera say?
That's 59%.
59%. And on mine, full battery. And bear in mind that this is the only battery we've used for the test on my camera, and on that one we did switch the batteries out after the indoor stuff.
We have used 2 batteries for this camera, and after every shot I turned this camera off.
And I've been walking around with this on for most of the shooting.
Yeah, this one is pretty power hungry.
Basically, in practicality, in no way does that win for practicality.
No, unfortunately not.
And we found that the shoulder rig, it's nice to have, but I'd much rather have a Zacuto recoil and this camera for comfort.
It's just not flexible enough. You can't adjust it in the way that you would need to.
And this has the autofocus too. So I think what it comes down to, because we've also discovered that just from looking at this, you don't really need RAW if you have 15 stops of dynamic range, I guess. I mean, it's kind of helpful sometimes, but it comes down to dynamic range versus practicality.
I reckon if you compared the C100 Mark II to the Ursa Mini 4K, the C100 Mark II would probably come out on top. It wouldn't have as much detail, but I think in every other category the C100 would win. Going through the footage, I have noticed that when you expose the cameras in ideal lighting situations, they're both pretty good, but when you go outside of what's an ideal lighting situation, the C100 definitely seems to have an advantage, where the Ursa Mini starts getting noisy and it has colour contrasts. And in a few of the LUTs I looked at on the Ursa Mini footage, especially the indoor ones, I could see some fixed pattern noise. But with some colour correcting, I was able to avoid any of that being apparent, or at least I think I have, judging by what I can see on these monitors. This does make me want a C200 for the added dynamic range. I know people say that you don't need 4K and full HD is enough, but even on these 1080p monitors when the image is just in a quarter of the screen, you can see the difference and you can see how much more detail is in the 4K image. So if I try and weigh up the pros and cons of each camera, C100 Mark II, practicality, and low light, maybe skin tones, maybe colour. That's a little bit of a draw with the Ursa Mini depending on what you're going for. Ursa Mini 4.6K, detail, dynamic range, and if you need it, then there is RAW, and it has 10-bit files as opposed to the C100 Mark II's 8-bit files, which gives you a bit more room to color grade in post. So what I've noticed from looking at this footage, and what I think this does really emphasize, is in ideal situations, it's comparable between the Canon Cinema series and the Blackmagic cameras. But if you're moving really quickly and you don't have time for long setups and to do lighting all the time, then the Canon Cinema series are a lot more robust and they're probably going to give you a better image. I know this might seem obvious to quite a few people, but if you look at Blackmagic's websites, especially with the Ursa Mini Pro and the Pocket Cinema camera, they look like they're being sold to people who do run and gun style filmmaking. But you've got to remember that the Ursa Mini 4.6K and all of the bits you need to go with it, that's more comparable to a C200 than a C100 Mark II, and of course the C200 has 15 stops of dynamic range and that also does 4K. So I'm quite interested to compare those two cameras. Hopefully I'll be able to do that in the future and to see which one I prefer. So despite seeing the benefits in the image quality of the Ursa Mini, it hasn't really made me regret buying the C100 Mark II or like my C100 Mark II any less. Yeah, it would be nice to have 4K and more dynamic range, but I guess that's what the C200 is for, and the C100 Mark II is really practical, and I do like the image that you get out of it. looking at the difference in colour science, it's very difficult to call a winner. It's more that there are just differences. I'd say the C100 Mark II definitely has more accurate colours, and it has a better rendition of red colours. I've noticed that its image tends to go more towards blue and green shades, whereas the Ursa Mini seems to have more orange in its image. And it also, when you point it at the sky, you don't get such a deep blue, you get more of a teal colour. I assume that is the way the colour science is working, and that's what people are talking about when they say that the Ursa Mini has a more film look, or I guess Blackmagic cameras in general have a more film look. I've tried to be as unbiased as possible and to be neutral in the camera comparison.
Not make any Blackmagic sarcastic comments.
Well, so far you're like, this has started off completely biased.
We've done a low light test just so that I can win.
C100 Mark II, definitely more practical, and by far it is the better low light camera. Ursa Mini 4.6K has more dynamic range, and you've got a RAW if you need it, and of course it's 4K, so there is way more detail. What I think everyone, including the Blackmagic fans, can agree on is that the Sigma R18-35 has a bit of chromatic aberration. I'm wondering if something has gone wrong with that lens, if it's been dropped or something else, because it shouldn't have that much chromatic aberration. Or maybe just shooting in 4K reveals more of a chromatic aberration. I don't know, but I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so as not to miss any new videos. See you later.
You're offending people with weak arms.